All right, welcome everybody to Module 2, where we're going to be exploring emotions, the self, and other important aspects of early development. All right, let's start with the role of exploratory play in learning. Now, a lot of what we covered in the last module when we talked about cognitive development, um, we talked about things being experience dependent, meaning that the quality um, of any individual's development depends to some degree on the quality of their environmental experiences. And in early childhood, play is a really important way in which children learn and acquire knowledge. Some research has been published that has found that when children from low socioeconomic status backgrounds are given games to play over a several week period during the study, that they make notable gains in certain cognitive tasks. And so we want to encourage a healthy amount of play in children. You know, that's an important aspect of their development. So there are neural pathways, brain regions, and mechanisms that are involved in things like motivation, exploration, the pursuit of rewards. And so these play a real central role in exploratory play with children, these seeking circuits, we call them. Seeking circuits because these are circuits associated with things like approaching new things, motivation to try new things, motivation to pursue goals, right? We're seeking, in other words, right? Approaching. These circuits play a really important role in behaviors that drive individuals to seek out new experiences, acquire information and knowledge, acquire resources that are necessary for survival and well-being in life. Attending college is a really good example of activation of these seeking circuits. You know, you have to be motivated to pursue college education, to explore new subjects and topics, to pursue rewards like a career later on. And so these seeking circuits play a real crucial role in healthy human development. And there are a number of brain regions that are associated with these seeking circuits, right? The prefrontal cortex, our amygdala, our hippocampus, the ventral tegmental area, and the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, is particularly important as this region of the brain is where the neurotransmitter dopamine is typically released in anticipation of something rewarding or pleasurable coming later. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, neurotransmitters being chemical messengers in the brain, and dopamine being a crucial neurotransmitter in motivational behavior, right? In keeping us on task and pursuing goals and objectives in life. And so the release of dopamine in response to anticipated rewards is a really important aspect of seeking circuits, right? That when we engage in an activity that's pleasurable or rewarding, we kind of learn that it has this positive value. The release of dopamine kind of strengthens then our desire to re-engage or do that again, do more of that, right? So when our natural drive to play and explore is positively reinforced, not only by the release of dopamine, but through encouragement, right, in our environment, right? Parents encouraging and allowing their children to play and explore, we experience pleasure and subjective well-being, right? We feel good. On the flip side of that, you can imagine a parent or parents who are really overly anxious or controlling when it comes to how their kids play and explore. And that can be really well intentioned, right, to keep kids safe, right? There are limits to what children can play and do, certainly. But still, it's important to encourage some degree of play and exploration, right, in children. So when parents might step in or intervene too much, kind of get in the way too much of their kids playing and exploring, that can create some confusion or distress for a kid, right? It can go from being kind of like positively reinforced to maybe more negatively reinforced, where now they might think that play and exploration is not okay for some reason, like it's causing anxiety in parents, which can cause some anxiety in the child, right? So it's important to allow for a certain healthy degree of play. Of course, we'll talk later when we get into parenting right? That there are limits that parents have to set, right, to keep children safe, but that it is important to allow kids to explore and play, because that plays also an important role in emotional regulation. What we mean by that, right, is that when we experience stress or tension, right, our seeking circuits can get sort of activated to help us pursue coping strategies or pursue activities that would soothe us in moments of stress or tension. Right, so seeking circuits thus play an important role in emotional regulation. So when we're upset or stressed out, seeking circuits sort of can get activated to push us toward then effective coping strategies, effective ways of soothing ourselves. So here we're going to talk a bit about emotions, right? Emotional development is a big part of this module. And we can think about emotions as a sort of internal representation of the overall quality of our experience in any moment. That might seem a little bit abstract, right? And what we're saying here, right, is that emotions are kind of like a reflection of whether our experience in that moment is kind of tilted toward more positive feeling, positive affect, or tilted more toward negative affect or negative feeling. So emotions are kind of like a barometer, right? They kind of measure or reflect kind of what is the quality of my experience in this moment, kind of good, bad, neutral. And then in each of those categories, right, good, bad, neutral, there are a lot of other words we have in our language, right, to describe different emotional experiences. And another important point when it comes to emotions, right, is that contrary to popular belief, and you'll hear this a lot, right, that emotion is crucial for cognitive and intellectual functioning. Right? And I say that because, there's this famous online commentator, right, who says facts don't care about your feelings. That for some reason feelings or emotions can kind of get in the way of thinking. And that is certainly true sometimes. I don't deny that. However, emotion and feeling is actually really, really important for cognitive and intellectual functioning. There's this kind of brain phenomenon known as the Phineas-Gage matrix, right, which highlights and emphasizes the relationship between cognitive dysfunction and emotional impairment. When certain areas of the brain related to emotional processing are disrupted or impaired, people actually struggle to plan their behavior, set goals, think and analyze, right? So what this is showing us then, that is healthy emotional processing is actually really crucial for the capacity to think and act, pursue goals, set goals for ourselves, set out the steps to achieve those goals. Right? So emotion and intellect really go hand in glove. They really go together. It's not that emotions get in the way of our thinking all the time. They, like I said, they certainly can, but we also need to rely on our emotions to kind of guide us, help us figure out what to do next. Right? That emotions give us this general representation of how we're feeling, and if we know how we're feeling, then we know what we might need then to adjust as necessary. So we need this emotional information in order to figure out, how to plan, how to cope, how to get through stress and distressing experiences. And so there is this debate on whether or not there are certain basic emotions. Are there quote unquote neural fingerprints and facial expressions associated with universal emotions, right? In other words, you'll hear people say sometimes that there are like 6 basic emotions, fear, anger, surprise, disgust, sadness, joy, that these are like universal emotions that all people experience. And the research on this idea of basic emotions, has been challenged. It's not clear whether or not there are specific, discernible, universal human emotions. that the words that we put to our emotional experiences may vary quite a bit. What does seem to be universal, though, is our ability to form concepts that make our physical sensations meaningful. In other words, language, right? Language comes in as a way of labeling and naming our experiences. And language is highly cultural, right? Expressions and words that we use to describe things can vary from culture to culture. So the constructivists view emotion as your brain's creation of what your bodily sensations mean, right? In other words, we are meaning-making creatures, right? That we have words and language to characterize and describe our experiences, and that language and the words that we use to describe those experiences can be quite different from place to place. So maybe all these different words and phrases are pointing to something universal, but they are nevertheless socially constructed, perhaps we could say. And so instead of looking at these universal basic emotions, another way of thinking about it is emotions that might fall into one of two buckets, right? Approach-related behaviors or avoidance sort of related behaviors. That different emotional experiences do to some extent seem to be mediated by certain neural networks in the brain, but that positive or negative might be a better way of thinking about this, that certain emotional experiences either have this more positive valence or negative valence. And when we talk about a positive affect system, we're talking about behaviors or attitudes that are related to approach-related behaviors, like showing interest in something, focusing on something that we're interested in, right? That we're like leaning in when we're displaying these more positive affects. Whereas a negative affect system supports more avoidance-related behaviors, right? Avoidance-related behaviors meaning things like withdrawing, right? Going away, moving away from something, shutting down, stepping away, right? And so we can kind of maybe think of emotions as falling into these different affect systems, either positive or negative. So when do people start expressing emotion? So it doesn't take too long, right? I mean, even in a nursery, right, at a hospital, at birth or right around birth, right, infants express distress, crying, contentment, smiling, and some disgust, right, like avoiding unpleasant smells or tastes. By 6 months, there does appear to be some differentiation between more negative emotions. So babies do start to differentiate between things like, for instance, anger and fear. And part of the reason why that might happen at 6 months is that they're starting to learn the difference between experiences that are upsetting and angering versus experiences that are more scary. And they're starting to now differentiate and tell the difference between they're taking a more kind of granular approach to their emotions, right, where they're able to tell the subtle differences between something like anger and fear. Like anger and fear, we could say, are both more maybe negative affect states, but they're not identical. And so we start to parse out the differences between these emotional experiences through our experience in the environment. So from about 1.5 to 2 years old, little kids, little babies, infants, do start to appear to display what we call more self-conscious emotions, like pride, feeling good about yourself, shame, feeling bad about yourself, embarrassment, feeling like you've done something silly or foolish, empathy, right, showing some concern for another person, or guilt, a sense that you've done something wrong. And we call them self-conscious emotions because these are emotions that relate to how we feel about ourselves, right? So pride, shame, embarrassment, empathy, and guilt are self-conscious in the sense that they refer back to us, right? How we feel about ourselves. By around 3 years old, it seems that under the right conditions, the full range of human emotions appears to be available. And I say the word available on purpose there, right? Where those emotions are available, whether or not a person experiences them or not, may depend on their experiences in their environment, whether those behaviors whether those emotions, I should say, are facilitated through the environment or not. So we'll talk a little bit here about the origins of empathy, right? And empathy meaning, the capacity to feel your way into the experience of another person, to look at the world through another person's eyes. We say to kind of step into their shoes, right, is what we're getting at with empathy. And there's some evidence that 4-month-olds can distinguish between fear and anger in others. So not only in themselves, but they can start to now also discern the difference between anger and fear in another person's behavior, facial expression, and so on. And a lot of the emotion processing that happens in early childhood happens through auditory channels. So interpreting emotions in others based on their tone of voice, how fast they're speaking, the pitch and sound of their voice, whether it's loud, kind of, shouting versus whispering, that they're taking in information auditorily, right, through hearing, to start to tell the difference between different kinds and different shades of different feelings. And that by 1.5 to 2, infants are starting to read others' facial expressions to make choices. So they're kind of reading the room a little bit more at this time. They're kind of looking at other people's faces and using that information to decide what to do next. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about emotion regulation, which we touched on in Module 1. But emotion regulation just refers to the capacity to moderate and modulate our emotional experience to meet the demands of a situation. And what that means is our emotions can run really high sometimes. We can feel overwhelmed and distressed. Emotion regulation is our ability to cope and modulate, tamp down, right? Turn the volume down on our emotions to meet the demands of a situation. So, for example, I might be having a really bad day. I might be feeling really stressed out, but I have a final exam I have to take, later this afternoon. Emotion regulation is what allows me to cope and soothe myself when I'm feeling that way so that I can meet the demands of the situation, so that I can take that final exam and try to, even if I'm having a bad day, that I have the capacity to soothe and de-stress in a way that allows me to pursue my goals. So how does this capacity develop? How do we learn how to regulate our emotions? Well, as it turns out, we learn how to do that in the context of a relationship in which we internalize a caring, responsive caregiver. In other words, through our positive experiences with the people around us, we begin to internalize a sort of caring, soothing presence, that we can rely on this internalized positive caregiver as a way to cope with overwhelming feelings. So it's really through a relationship that we learn to become more independent ourselves. And that's sort of a central paradox in human development, is that independence, being an independent person, arises from the experience of being dependent on someone else first. So in healthy development, babies and caregivers synchronize. And by synchronize, I mean that caregivers begin to notice the cues and signals from their babies that indicate that they need to respond in some way. The parents become more responsive to what their babies need. They get in sync with each other, right? So if a baby is displaying a certain face or making certain sounds that indicate that they're hungry or in need of something, the parents start to attune to their baby's needs in this way. And this is where, like we saw with Erik Erikson's model, right, of trust versus mistrust, that this is where those positive, responsive caregivers instill a sort of sense of trust in the environment on the part of the baby, and that trust is developed through this synchronization that caregivers and babies get into together. Of course, right, it doesn't always go well, right? If you've ever raised a baby or been a part of raising a baby, you know that interactions between caregivers and babies can be messy. Sometimes it's hard to be responsive to a crying baby. It's hard to do that every day. It's hard to get it all right, right? So we have this idea of rupture and repair where it's okay for things to get messy. It doesn't have to be perfect. What matters is that we notice when things are going wrong and then take steps to try and repair the situation. And that can look a lot of different ways, right? But the key is just that there's a caregiver there who accurately responds to their child's needs, and when that fails, when they're not meeting their child's needs, that they find a way to restore trust through then working through those difficulties with their children. So I've posted a video to Canvas that you'll be watching on the still face paradigm. This was a study done by a psychologist named Edward Tronick, and his goal was to study the interactions between infants and their caregivers. And you'll see how this goes by watching the video, but essentially you've got a caregiver and a baby paired together, and they instruct the caregiver to begin by smiling, laughing, synchronizing with the baby, right? So you'll see, right, that babies and caregivers, when they're in sync with each other, right, there'll be a certain amount of reflection of positive feeling, like laughing, smiling, and all of that. But what they do then is they instruct the parent at some point to have a still face, like a stony face, where they look emotionless. And they ask the caregiver to keep that sort of still face expression for a while. And they note how the baby reacts. And as you'll see in the video, babies typically react with confusion and sometimes even distress or upset when the parents go still face. And then finally they ask the parents to then try to re-engage the baby by smiling and laughing and playing again and see how the baby responds to this. And so what we're really looking for is the impact of the disruption. What happens when the parents and baby are smiling together and then the parent goes still face, right? And what the still face paradigm demonstrates is the significant emotional and behavioral impact on infants when their caregivers adopt a non-responsive demeanor. In other words, when parents or caregivers stop responding to the baby's smiling and laughing. Babies are expecting that when they're smiling and laughing and playing, they're expecting to see that reflected or mirrored by their caregivers. Infants expect these reciprocal interactions and often become distressed when these expectations are not met. So what you'll see in the video is that when caregivers maintain this still face, infants often, right, are going to look confused, sad, or anxious. You'll see, and it's kind of sad. I mean, some of these videos, they're kind of hard to watch sometimes, actually, because you can see that the babies are starting to get quite upset. They start to even try to re-engage the caregiver, right, by like reaching out to them, vocalizing, looking kind of confused and upset. And what they're doing in those moments is they're showing, right, their need for this social connection, to reconnect with the caregiver. And they're kind of desperately reaching out and trying to re-engage the still-faced caregiver. And then what happens when the caregivers return to being more responsive and start synchronizing with babies again, the babies will typically show some relief, right, and quickly kind of like reconnect. And that's kind of what we mean when we talk about rupture and repair, right? So if a mom or dad, right, is just having a really bad day and it's hard for them to reflect or mirror their baby's excitement or joy, right? They might look upset, they might look angry, and that can cause the baby to feel pretty distressed, right? At some point, you try to, as a parent, self-regulate, you know, reflect on what's happening in the moment, and then try to re-engage the baby. And the babies are typically responsive to that re-engagement. And so all of this just really underscores the importance of an emotionally supportive environment, right, for babies' well-being. So one of the most important theories that we'll cover in the class, particularly as it relates to emotional and social development, is attachment theory. You might have seen a TikTok on attachment theory, or some, social media influencers talking about attachment. So there's a lot of, not so great information about it online. And so we'll try to focus on what we do know and what is relevant for human development. But attachment theory believes that there is this evolutionary system whose function and purpose is to maintain closeness, proximity between caregivers and infants. And why is it important for caregivers and infants to remain close by or nearby? Well, for protection and security, right? Babies are very vulnerable, right? Babies, for a long time, human beings are really dependent and rely on caregivers for protection and safety. That caregivers help babies learn how to soothe and regulate themselves, right, through receiving this nurturing care from somebody. And so attachment theory believes that there are certain behaviors that are viewed as activating the attachment system. So crying, when a baby is distressed and upset and crying, it's sort of like an activation of this need for protection, comfort, security. Or clinging behavior, right? Babies kind of clinging close by to a caregiver sort of activates the parent's sort of instinct to then pick the baby up and cradle them, right, if they need to be close, right? Synchronizing, which we talked about a couple of slides ago, right, is a sort of activation of the attachment system, right? Reading the baby's cues and signals for hunger, for whatever it might be that a baby's needing, that we're synchronizing, responding to the baby's emotional needs, which activates this attachment system. And so one of the important ideas from attachment theory is this idea of working models or relational templates. We'll talk about the different attachment styles later, but for now, we say that an attachment style influences expectations and behaviors in relationships with others, right? That our experiences early in life give us a kind of set of expectations of what we can expect others to do in relationships with us. It's sort of a knowledge of how relationships work. This is kind of implicit knowledge, right? How does a relationship function and work? We register that, we internalize a sort of template or model of relationships, and we do that in the context of a relationship with a caregiver or parent. You could think of it as like a blueprint or template for how to relate to other people. And we typically start to see a more full-fledged attachment by around 8 months. And if you recall from Module 1, it said around 8 months old that we start to notice separation anxiety, which is correlated then with the emergence of an attachment. So, the first several months of life, babies are pretty much happy to be around anyone, right? They don't necessarily differentiate so much between mom or dad or aunt or uncle or grandma or grandpa. They're pretty happy and pleased to be around just about anyone. But at around 8 months, they start to really show a preference for certain people. In other words, they've started to form an attachment, usually to their caregivers, mom, dad, right? In the first 2 months, right, infants typically signal their needs, right? By 2 to 6 months, infants show preferences for particular caregivers. And by 6 months, infants show a strong preference for a particular caregiver. Again, this is showing us the evolution of attachment, that they start to prefer certain people, right? Like now grandma isn't as good as mom, right? Or it could be the other way around, it really depends. It's kind of case by case. right? But that there is a preference for a particular person, and usually that preference forms because there have been maybe a lot of positive experiences with that particular caregiver. So a baby starts to form an attachment with that individual. So again, we can say that attachment is correlated with the emergence of separation anxiety and object permanence. That once we've got mental representations, right? Like again, we use that term mental representations when we talk about cognitive development, symbolically representing our experiences mentally, right? That at the same time that we're able to more symbolically represent our experiences and start to display more separation anxiety, we've also formed attachments. So another video that you're going to see on Canvas is an experiment that was done by this psychologist named Harry Harlow, who studied these macaque monkeys when they were trying to determine are animals, humans, primarily motivated by just instinctual needs like satisfying hunger. In other words, when we looked at Freud's theory, for example, right, we saw that he really saw humans as being driven by these instinctual drives. And then we said that later on, this theory was sort of adapted or modified to the extent that relationships and comfort and safety and protection are as important, perhaps even more important than just meeting basic hunger needs. And so what you're going to see in this video is which type of monkey mother, right? You're going to see that they kind of have these fake monkey mothers, right? One just is like kind of a steel monkey that just has a bottle attached to it. The theory here is that if we are just driven by satisfying needs like hunger, then it really doesn't matter how comforting or protecting a caregiver is, because as long as we're fed, we're happy, right? That's the theory there. On the other hand, if there are things that are more important or as important to us, like comfort and protection, then it may be that monkeys will be typically drawn not just to food itself, but to the nurturing and care provided by, and you'll see in the video, right, they have monkeys that are kind of softer, right, that have blankets attached around them, or that look and feel more warm. And so I want you to watch the video and kind of notice what you observe in terms of the preference that the monkeys display for the different types of mothers that are available to them. And again, yes, this was a study that was done with non-human, animals, but I think it does show us something interesting about development early in life when it comes to are we primarily driven again by the need to satisfy biological needs, or are we just as driven? Is it just as important to not only meet our biological needs, but to feel warmth and comfort and safety in the presence of a caregiver? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of attachment theory, where this theory came from. As you'll recall from our first module, we talked about how when it comes to a theory, it is important to put that theory into a historical context, a cultural context. And there is a very unique and interesting cultural and historical context in which attachment theory was formed. So we have to start in the early 1900s, where it was very common for infants to be kept hospitalized for very long stretches of time in isolation. So these babies, these infants, were kept in cribs, in rooms, but generally segregated from other babies and generally segregated from people. They were kind of left alone a lot of the time. This would happen in some cases when a mom would get pregnant and then have a baby, and if there were an older child at home, sometimes they'd actually also put like an older child, like a small toddler or infant, in hospital for a couple of weeks while mom was tending to the new baby. Or if a young infant got sick, they would isolate them in the hospital out of fear of, spreading illness or virus or something like that. But generally speaking, the point here is that this actually wasn't really all that great for the babies. That it was pretty common in the early 1900s for not only infants but kids to be, young kids to be kept in, small rooms isolated from others. This was kind of a major social problem in the early 1900s. And what they found was that this was incredibly detrimental, as you can imagine, to a child's social and emotional development to be kept isolated and away from others. The nurses were even instructed not to, even make eye contact or try to engage with the babies in their rooms when they were supposed to be sleeping or just passing through the hallway. And anyway, these were very, problematic practices, we could say. And so a young psychoanalyst named John Bowlby, who is sort of a pioneer of attachment theory, he studied infant development as a psychoanalyst, and he really became one of the kind of architects of what we know as attachment theory today. And he really challenged this idea that whatever happens in the early years of life isn't really that important for babies. That was one of the questions in the icebreaker activity that we did, right? Are events that happen in the first 3 years of life, can those have permanent effects on a person? And we may debate on permanent effects, of course, right? But it's undeniably true that experiences in the first few years of life have very significant, important impacts on a person's development. It was believed back then, and maybe some of you would agree with this, even though this point of view is largely discredited today. That babies don't really know what's going on, that experiences they're having aren't really that important. Like, they don't really remember anyway. And because they don't have memories of their, babyhood, that it's not really that important what happens. And that really couldn't be further from the truth. So even if you're saying that, well, I don't even really remember what happened to me when I was 1 or 2, that doesn't mean that the experiences you had at that time weren't important or had an impact on how you developed, because they absolutely do. And so John Bowlby recognized this, and he challenged this idea that early environmental experiences are highly significant to emotional and social development. One key finding from Bowlby's work was that unresolved conflicts from a parent's childhood could influence their interactions with their children. So here are a couple of examples from some of the research that he conducted. In one of Bowlby's cases, there was a father who really severely punished his little boy whenever he caught him masturbating. So if the little boy was like touching himself, right, the father would plunge him under cold water as a punishment. And what Bowlby later found through kind of discussing this with the father is that the father had his own personal issues around masturbation most of his life. So, we can see how if a parent is struggling through some personal problem of their own, that gets projected right onto the child and becomes a source of conflict for the child now. In another case, there was a mother who was extremely punitive, right, to her 3-year-old daughter because she was envious of a new sibling. So the mother didn't like how this 3-year-old was getting really jealous and envious of the new sibling. And so the mother later disclosed to Bowlby that she had always been jealous of her younger brother. So again, we can see parallels, right, between what a parent experienced growing up and then how they enact some of those problems with their children. And I guess you could call this, what we call today intergenerational trauma, right? This idea that certain problems or traumas are sort of transmitted through time in the ways that parents reenact some of their own problems with their own children. So one thing that Bowlby and his colleagues were studying in these attachment studies was maternal loss or separation. What happens to an infant when
mother is absent or there is a prolonged separation. Now, this research, you'll have to understand, right, occurred during and after World War II. So during World War II, when the Nazis were bombing England, they evacuated the large cities, right, that were being bombed. And they relocated a lot of families and children to hospitals and other, castles, other estates, other places in the countryside where they would be safe from the bombing. And they would separate in some cases, the children were separated from their families. They were kind of just taken to, it's almost like in foster care. And so Bowlby and his colleagues wanted to study what effect would that have on a child, right, to be separated for a long, prolonged period of time from a caregiver. And what they found was there's actually this really strong correlation between maternal deprivation, maternal loss or separation, and later juvenile delinquency, which is an interesting correlation. Now, as with all correlations, right, we can't necessarily make causal claims based on a correlation, but we can note that that's an interesting relationship, and that if we were to study that a little bit more, we might see some factors relating to early separation, loss, and later delinquent behavior. So observational studies of children separated from their parents in hospitals led to a typical sequence of behavior. So they noted this sort of typical sequence of behaviors that children displayed when they were separated from a parent or caregiver. So it started with protest, right? A kid sort of fussing and protesting and being kind of, grouchy and upset and demanding that they see their mother again, protesting being separated away. After a period of protest, there was a period of despair where the children would just become visibly upset and sad, right? Pouting, crying, just really, really distressed. And after that phase passed, right, they noticed a detachment, which is that the children no longer displayed any kind of visible emotion, kind of more blunted affect, like more neutral, withdrawn sort of affect. And this was a sort of like, well, I guess this is my new reality. My parents are just gone, and I'm just going to have to, I guess, deal with it. And so, they became really much more sort of unemotional and unexpressive. And from these studies, Bowlby concluded that a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with a loving caregiver was essential for mental health in the early years, that it is important for a child to have a connection to, and note the word caregiver, right? Whether that's a parent, a step parent, it could be any caring person, adult, right? But that having a continuous and ongoing caring relationship with a loving caregiver was essential for a child's social and emotional development. And so Bowlby then conceptualized this idea of an attachment system, and he was really influenced by a popular theory at the time based in cybernetics known as general systems theory and control theory, leading him to assert that there were dynamic interacting systems involved in attachment, right? Systems theory, as we discussed in Module 1 with multidimensional systems theories are all about how, whole systems are comprised of smaller subsystems, interrelated subsystems that interact, that give rise to these dynamic interactions that make up the whole larger system. And so he posited then that there is this attachment system, an exploratory system, and a fear system that respond to feedback from each other. Now, there's some debate around whether or not these sort of fear circuits and even the seeking circuits that we looked at earlier in this lecture, there's some debate around whether these kind of neural fingerprints or systems are universal or traceable in all people. But the theory itself might still give us some insight into behavioral development all the same, right? So, for example, initiation of the fear system can activate the attachment system. So, a child who experiences distress or fear will then activate the attachment system, right, by crying or clinging or doing something to seek out the caregiving and support that they're needing, that they're wanting. The exploratory system, which we could say is like related to the seeking circuit that we just discussed, is operational when a child can explore the environment without engaging in attachment behaviors like maintaining proximity. So the exploratory system is really what's going on when the child starts to feel more independent and can move about and explore their environment without needing to cling to mom, right? That's actually a really good sign of emotional development, is when a child can start exploring without needing mom there, right? It starts to build some confidence, right? Again, if we go to Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, this is now getting into that stage where, children feel like their self-esteem is boosted by exploring and, playing in their environments. And there are some, what we might say, are sort of biological basis of attachment. There's a hormone known as oxytocin, and this is a hormone that's released in the body that facilitates bonding. Oxytocin is released in both mother and baby during moments of engagement, like looking into each other's eyes, laughing and smiling as they look into each other's eyes, breastfeeding. Actually the same thing is happening in couples as well, right? When couples are kind of laughing and gazing in each other's eyes, loving, right, hugging, kissing, that this oxytocin is released, which strengthens a bond between people. It's actually the case that the evolution of dogs, actually over the course of evolution, as wolves were domesticated into dogs, that over time dogs and humans also release oxytocin when they are playing or looking into each other's eyes. That facilitates and strengthens the bond between a dog and their person. So oxytocin plays this important role in social cooperation, sexual reproduction, empathy, and even forgiveness, right? It's what allows us to maybe forgive, right? When we have a strong bond to someone else, that we're willing to extend grace and forgiveness to someone who might have hurt us. On the other hand, the kind of darker side of oxytocin is that it may also promote defense of the in-group versus the out-group, meaning because we're so bonded with our loved ones and the people close to us, the flip side of that is that it makes us maybe less compassionate or warm towards people we consider to be outside of our groups, or in an out group of some kind. And we could maybe look at that, and we'll look at all the kinds of social problems we have today between, racism, xenophobia, and so on, right? That there's this sort of in-group versus out-group behavior. And oxytocin is actually kind of implicated in that same kind of tribal affiliation within groups. The oxytocin reduces neuroendocrine stress responding. So again, kind of promotes healthy coping. Okay, now on Canvas, you're also going to watch a video on this experiment called The Strange Situation. And The Strange Situation was an experimental study designed by one of John Bowlby's most important collaborators, named Mary Ainsworth. And she developed this experiment as a way of identifying distinct attachment styles. Okay, and by attachment styles, we just mean different ways in which children attach to a caregiver. And so you'll see a description of this in the video as you watch it. I won't dwell on this long here. I'll give you a chance to watch it on Canvas, and you can kind of get an idea of the setup and what they were doing, and how they operationalized attachment based on the experiment they ran. Now, based on The Strange Situation experiment, 4 different types of, well, actually, I should go back. 3 different types of attachment style were described, and a 4th one was added later by other contributors to the attachment literature in the 80s. I think the disorganized, disoriented, insecurely attached style was added later on. At first, there were 3 different types of attachment styles that they identified, distinct attachment styles they identified as a result of this experiment. The first and most common was securely attached. These were children who showed some distress when they were separated from the mother in the experiment, and will actually take some time to look for her, right? They'll be upset, they'll be sad. I mean, where did mom go? And they'll take a look around. Though they may, some not all, right, regulate themselves enough to still explore the environment in mom's absence. And when mom comes back, right, when she re-entered the room, they were really happy to see mom again. They would like give mom a big hug and a kiss, but then they would go back to exploring the room. Now that mom's back, cool, I'm safe to play. So that's the idea with a secure attachment, is that mom is viewed as a secure base, a safe haven. So when she's there, we can get comfort from her. But because she's a secure base, we can also explore freely without fear or worry, right? Because she's nearby. Another style they noticed was the anxious, ambivalent, insecurely attached. These were kids who showed unusually high distress when separated from the caregiver. So it went beyond just kind of like pouting and crying a little bit to like maybe even tantruming and screaming. These infants appear angry and upset when mom comes back, right? So unlike the securely attached infants and toddlers, the anxious, ambivalent children, when they were reunited with mother, were actually pretty mad, right? Angry at her for having left. And then they don't tend to fall back into play as easily when mom returns. The third style they noted was avoidant, insecurely attached. So these kids do not appear to show really any distress when mom leaves. It's like they're completely unbothered by mom leaving. They're like, whatever, it's all good. Fine. They didn't really seem to be upset at all. And when mom comes back, they don't really seem to pay much attention to mom when she re-enters the room. But what's interesting is that they've done these studies where they've shown that even when these kids look on the outside to be unbothered, like unaffected, that their heart rate indicated that they were experiencing some kind of stress arousal. And so, you can think of that as people who on the outside might look very stony faced and unbothered, but on the inside might be kind of distressed, kind of upset. They kind of are hiding it maybe. And that gives you a pretty good indication of like, well, that would raise an interesting question. Why is it that when I'm feeling really stressed or upset or tense, I feel it's really important for me to look like I've got it all together? And then you have the disorganized, disoriented, which is another form of insecure attachment. So you can see here that there are 3 styles of insecurely attached and just one secure attached, right? Securely attached is the most common type of attachment style across most of these studies. And then there are 3 distinct subtypes of insecure attachment. The last one is disorganized, disoriented, where these babies tended to alternate between wanting to interact with the caregiver, but avoiding her when she appeared, and would show, again, unusually sort of mixed reactions, like they weren't sure how to react. That's kind of the disoriented piece here, right? Like, not sure what to do, not sure how to act, appearing to be maybe even confused about the presence of the caregiver being there. Okay, so the quality of caregiving and attachment, right, are really intimately then related. The quality of caregiving during infancy has a significant influence on attachment. And how do we measure quality of caregiving? Because again, how do we operationalize or measure attachment behaviors in these studies? Well, what we're looking for is how responsive caregivers are to their child's needs, right? If the child's appearing to be in need of comfort, proximity, touch, whatever, right? That parents are responding to those needs in a relatively prompt way. If parents are supportive and helpful during a difficult task, so if they see their child struggling on something, that they're providing, timely support and help, that they display more physical affection, right? Hugging, kissing, cradling, and that they show insight, reflective awareness, that parents are able to sort of reflect on how their behavior, how their actions play a role in those interactions with their children, right? That they show a sort of, as we covered in Module 1, theory of mind, right? That they understand that a child or baby may be acting the way they are because they're needing something. In other words, not just because they're a difficult little brat, right? You may be tempted to say that about some kids, and some babies may even appear to act that way, but what they're doing is they're not looking at baby's behavior as a function of their personality or temperament. They're looking at baby's behavior as a function of maybe what they're needing in the moment, right? They're looking at more contextual factors, not just personality factors when it comes to why a baby might be acting out. That shows theory of mind, right? That shows what we call reflective functioning. But we do need to think about what baby brings to the table, right? Because so far we've been talking a lot about what caregivers should do or what caregivers need to do. And what we haven't talked about as much is, well, babies, though, do bring something to the table, right? Like a temperament, we could say. So we know that quality caregiving certainly matters, but babies do not enter the world as blank slates, right? A baby's temperament also influences caregiving. So again, this is a systemic way of looking at human development, that quality of caregiving is an environmental factor, but that the individual or genetic factor would be the baby's temperament itself. And there is research to support the idea that a person's temperament is absolutely genetically influenced, okay? So fearfulness, reactivity, irritability, and negative emotionality can all be observed and measured in babies within just hours and days of birth. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about temperament, right? How fearful does the baby appear? How reactive are they? How irritable do they get? How much negative emotionality do they display? A lot? A little? A tiny bit? Right? That's what we're looking at with temperament, right? Low versus high reactivity, right, in a baby. And a baby's temperament, again, does appear to arise from biologically based patterns of reactivity that are further influenced, though, by interactions with the environment. So again, going back to Module 1, we're talking about nature and nurture. We're talking about both and, right, not either or. That the temperament is a sort of biological contribution, a genetic contribution, but then the quality of caregiving is an environmental contribution. And those things are in a dynamic interaction. So let's talk a little bit more about temperaments, right? We have quote unquote easy babies. Now they did longitudinal studies on temperaments, and you'll read more about the longitudinal studies in your reading this week. But easy babies made up about 40% of the study sample. These were babies that were, just more chill, more placid, less active, more positive affect, right? More cheerful, maybe more smiling. Then you had the quote unquote slow to warm up babies, which made up about 15% of the study sample. These were somewhat similar to difficult babies, but less intense. So, that's where the slow to warm up comes from. Like, these were babies who were maybe a little bit edgy and irritable, but then eventually they would warm up, right? They would seem to even out. And finally, you had what they would call difficult babies, which was about 10%. So a relatively small number of the babies were difficult babies. And these were babies that were more fearful, more irritable, more reactive, more negative affect, right? So maybe more crying, more what we call colic, okay? And then we had this uncategorized group, which was about 35% of the sample. And here the traits were too variable to fall into any defined group. So you have this whole big category of babies that kind of demonstrate some traits of all of these. They were difficult to categorize. And so this idea of goodness of fit comes in to describe how caregiving style has to match the baby's temperament to get the right fit. So, goodness of fit then refers to the way parents adjust their caregiving to meet the baby's needs, right? So, yeah, you might not like having a difficult baby because it's hard, because it's really demanding. But difficult babies need more, right? They just do. They just need more, support in certain ways because they're just kind of difficult, right? If parents can't match their caregiving to the baby's needs, then we say we don't have goodness of fit there, and that's where we're going to expect, some problems maybe to arise. So in one longitudinal study that they conducted, 70% of the difficult babies experienced adjustment-related problems later in life, like getting in trouble for stealing, trouble in school, delinquency, and things like that. That's a pretty significant number, right? So of those difficult babies, 7 out of 10 experience some more serious problems later in life. What separated the 30% of difficult babies who didn't experience those problems was, you guessed it, right? The quality of caregiving, right? If parents can alter their caregiving to meet the baby's needs, more positive outcomes are likely. Also, some interesting cultural differences maybe to note with attachment. Secure attachments, again, have been observed in the majority of children across cultures, but there are cultural differences in how parents parent, right? So we might expect there to be some variation from culture to culture. The most important thing, though, is that however it is displayed, however it might be culturally different, sensitive care to a child's needs is essential for healthy emotional development. And what we mean, again, by sensitive care to a child's needs would be things like that synchronizing with the baby, providing, safety and security, responsiveness to their communication and needs, providing timely responses to to their pleas for support, avoiding prolonged separations or extended separations for long periods of time, right? This kind of thing, right, is what we're getting at when we talk about sensitive care to a child's needs. This is where, we ask other questions like, what about the role of fathers and dads? And yeah, of course, right? Fathers are important. Children do form attachments to their dads too, right? Like that certainly is possible. Certainly not only possible, but likely, right? That children are going to develop attachments to important people in their lives, which could include grandparents as well, right? Under certain circumstances, it could include aunts and uncles and whole families. Of course, it's also important to note that when it comes to attachment, though, children will tend to prefer certain adults, and not every adult that they encounter. Does attachment evolve over time, or is it relatively stable? What do you think? Well, it can evolve over time, and it can also be relatively stable. So the answer is both. It does evolve, right? We have new experiences and new relationships that afford us opportunities to form new types of relationships. We can achieve what in the attachment literature is called earned security. So like an insecurely attached baby can earn security through supportive, loving, caring relationships later in life. It can kind of earn that security back. But at the same time, longitudinal studies on attachment have shown that these are relatively stable constructs over time as well. So, as with any other theme in development, again, we're talking about dynamic interactions between the environment and the individual. We're going to keep coming back to that all semester, so we're going to keep that in mind, right? We're talking about dynamic environmental interactions, and that the environment itself is a dynamic context of interlocking systems, right? All of these things, there are a lot of things that can influence the quality of attachment, like growing up in poverty, for example, right? That can provide a certain level of stress and strain on parents. That can make, then that could have downstream effects, right? Growing up in poverty can have downstream effects on attachment, right? That's a possibility. That is not to say that growing up in poverty causes insecure attachment. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that there are these other factors, though, that can contribute to the strain that families experience, and we should take those into consideration when we're doing assessments of people's attachment. Like marital conflict, how often parents are fighting or bickering or arguing, right? That obviously plays a role in the availability of responsive caregiving, right? If the parents in the relationship are too busy arguing and fighting most of the time, they're maybe not going to be able to be very responsive caregivers, will they? Right? There's all kinds of like traumatic or frightening experiences that are outside of a family's control, like natural disasters. What if there were an earthquake, or a tornado, or a hurricane, or some kind of, war? I mean, think about, what's going on right now in the Middle East, in Palestine when it comes to the number of deaths. These are traumatic experiences that are obviously going to have psychological effects on the people who live there. And so here are some questions to consider then around childcare, right? Given what we've covered so far, what advice would you give to a friend or family member who is considering daycare options for their baby or toddler? Based on what we've just covered when it comes to early social and emotional development, what things do you think should be considered when making that decision? So I want you to kind of reflect on that as part of thinking clinically right now about what would we want to make sure that daycare has in place, or when would it be a bad idea potentially to send a child to daycare? Under what circumstances or conditions would a parent not want to do that? So I want you to kind of reflect and think on that. Okay, so now we're going to be moving into the part of the lecture where we talk about the development of self. Okay, and to start, here's an interesting question to ponder. Do you have a self? And you're probably thinking, yeah, I do. Okay, but if you do, how do you know? Where does that knowledge come from that you have a self? Just saying like, well, because I have a name. Well, okay, that's a start, maybe. How do you know that there is such a thing as a self? So it's kind of a philosophical question. But as it turns out, this is kind of a deeper, challenging question to answer. We might all agree that we all have a self. But when I think about having a self, personally, I think about the only reason I have a self is because I exist in some sort of relationship to something outside of me, right? Like if I existed in a total vacuum, right? Like in empty space with nothing around, it's just like that's kind of a thought experiment, I guess, right? Would be to imagine like a baby growing up in total, and that's the thing, if a baby grew up in total isolation, obviously it would die, right? It would die, clearly. So how do we know we have a self? Because from the very beginning, we are connected to something that's not me, right? Other people. There are other things around me that are not me. And so the not me is in sort of contrast to the me and the not me, right? So that's how I think about it, at least, that I know I have a self because of the social relationships and the relationships to things and people outside of me. So we have here what's called the self system, right? Given all the functions the self must perform, some researchers talk about it as a quote unquote system. So what functions does this self system perform, right? It's a decision maker, right? Got to figure out what to do. It's a regulator, right? How do we keep things in balance? It maintains self-esteem, so trying to keep the self feeling relatively positive and good about itself so that it feels competent and confident to keep growing and moving forward in life, right, with some level of confidence. Represents self-concepts, so thoughts about the self, right? Self-concept refers to how I think about myself, the thoughts and feelings and opinions and beliefs I have about myself, right? That all of that is embedded in the self system. So on this topic of the development of the self, there's this very interesting term coined by a psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott that I found to be particularly useful clinically when working with children, teenagers, and adults. But in Donald Winnicott's psychoanalytic theory, a false self arises under conditions of persistent maternal impingements or intrusions. So an impingement would be kind of an intrusive, annoying, sort of irritating intrusion into the baby's space, right? Kind of space invasion, but too much, right? Too much kind of like fussing and, touching and prodding and, just kind of overly intrusive parent, all right? So he believed that, these frequent impingements or intrusions could actually be detrimental to a child's sense of self. Because what's happening is that the baby ends up adapting to the environment by kind of constructing a persona that meets the demands of caregivers and others. So in other words, right, the baby learns to suppress maybe or push away some of his or her own instinctual needs or desires this is kind of like the origin of people pleasing, I guess you could say, right? It's kind of the origin maybe of that behavior, is that the baby tends to adapt to the needs of others and pushes away their own needs. So if a child's needs are neglected or they are subjected to relentless criticism, the child may respond by suppressing affect, right? Like not showing any sort of response or reaction. And which this kind of creates a false self that is more acceptable or pleasing to the caregivers. So again, this relates really strongly to this notion of people pleasing. So we would say that a people pleaser is not being their true self, right? That they're putting other people's needs, other people's feelings ahead of their own, but too often, too much, right? Like it's good to be altruistic, right? It's good to place concern or consideration for others. Like obviously that's a good thing, but too much of that, too much pushing aside our own needs and wants for the needs of others can lead to this sense of like, who am I? Where are my needs? Who's there for me kind of question. And that can seem maybe narcissistic, but it's perfectly natural to want our own needs and wants to be cared for and considered by others too, right? Some reciprocity, back and forth. The true self would then represent an individual's authentic thoughts and feelings and experiences, unperturbed by these environmental demands. So we'll talk a little bit about the development of self in the context of attachment then. Right, across these many theories of self, there is growing consensus that whatever the self represents, it seems to be a social creation, and that arises particularly in early development, because the interactions with our family, that's our entry point into society itself, right? Our family is our first point of contact with society. So that's where this kind of sense of self will start to emerge, right, in the context of these social relationships at home, right? No one operates in a vacuum, right? We all have relationships to important people early in life. So if the self is a social creation, then we would be well advised to look at the earliest social relationships that a person has, again, the family system, right, being our first point of contact with the social world. So in the first several months of life, it seems unlikely that babies have a totally differentiated sense of self, right? Particularly in the early months, right, where they don't discriminate between different faces and people yet. Like we said, right, a baby is perfectly happy to be cared for by really anyone in the early months of life, right? They don't yet show a strong preference, for one person or another, very typically early, like in the first months of life. For the baby, the outside world might as well just be a continuation of the baby itself, right? An extension of the baby's experience, right? It has not yet completely discriminated between the me and the not me, right? It might be all just kind of a unitary whole to the baby. So imitation and sense perception. Some precursors to a growing sense of self, though, include things like imitation and this idea of deferred imitation, concepts that were covered in earlier readings from last week and this week. Imitation, so, like if you stick your tongue out at a baby and then they stick their tongue out back, right? They're kind of imitating, right? And this is maybe the kind of beginning sense of that's you doing this and that's me doing this. So slowly sort of differentiating, the me versus the not me. Here's a question I want you to think about based on the reading is why would deferred imitation seem like a precursor to a sense of self? Well, and remember, as a kind of reminder, right, with deferred imitation, that's the idea that a baby will imitate a behavior or action like sticking out their tongue or waving their hand or making some kind of gesture, that they'll learn that behavior from somebody that they're watching or observing or learning it from, and then later on, like hours or days later, they'll repeat that gesture without seeing it first, right? So that does seem to suggest then this kind of like emerging agency, right? Like they're choosing to repeat this behavior on their own without having seen someone else do it first. So kind of starting to kind of do things of their own volition, right? Babies grow in their capacity to map bodily experiences to the outside world. So in other words, right, they repeat the same gestures or behaviors over and over, and there's this growing recognition, right, that they have that this particular breast, this particular bottle is providing me nourishment. They're now starting to kind of differentiate objects in the environment. And eventually they connect these experiences of being nourished and cared for with a particular caregiver. So again, remember, like they're on 8 months. So later on, toward the end of the first year, this is when separation anxiety, attachment, all start to emerge. So now they're beginning to connect positive experiences with particular people, which is why maybe they're showing a strong preference for certain individuals that are consistently meeting their needs. So again, just to summarize again, toward the end of the first year, here are some important achievements. Kind of a full-blown attachment to a caregiver, that concept of object permanence that we covered in the last module, separation anxiety, and now we're talking about purposeful, planned, goal-directed behaviors. Do all of these phenomena point to a self? And I would say that they do, right? That these start to point toward individuality, right? Slowly growing out of first dependence on others and then kind of internalizing and learning, right, behaviors and then repeating them on their own, kind of like I'm choosing to do this now, right? I'm sort of making decisions about how I'm going to act. And that starts to point then to a self. So I'll post videos on Canvas that you'll see that are sort of tests of self-recognition, right? So self-recognition, like recognizing that's me in the mirror. So you'll look at the mirror test as a test of self-recognition. So watch that on Canvas, and then that'll be included in your discussion prompt. Another one that we're going to look at is the self as obstacle test, right? This is another interesting video that you'll watch. And basically, the idea here is that the baby is asked to push this cart, but they're standing on a blanket that's tied to the cart. And so what's going on here, right? They're basically, the baby tries to push the cart, but it has to realize that in order to move the cart, it actually has to step off of that blanket to move it, right? And so that would indicate then some recognition that they are the obstacle that's keeping the cart from moving. So they have to move off of it. And again, this would point to an emerging kind of sense of differentiating between me and the objects around me. And we do note that there are some cultural differences in this emerging sense of self. In more individualistic cultures, like Western cultures, we might say, infants seem to pass the mirror test earlier than babies from more collectivistic cultures. Right? By collectivistic cultures, we mean cultures, that are more typically associated less with individuality and more with the collective family or the collective society. So these would be more like East Asian cultures, some African cultures. And so in these more collectivistic cultures, the infants seem to pass the self as obstacle, I should say, test earlier than babies from more individualistic cultures. And the question would be, how would you explain this observed difference between individualistic and collectivistic cultures in terms of how we account for these cultural differences? That's a question maybe to ponder as you're reading. Self-evaluation. So when do we begin judging and evaluating ourselves? Right? If you remember, we said self-conscious emotions like pride, guilt, shame, embarrassment, all start to emerge at around 1.5 to 2. So by 2 years, there's this big expansion of vocabulary and language that make these self-evaluations possible. Because as a baby's language expands, so too does its capacity then to describe its experience, right? Maltreated children tend to view their reflection in the mirror with more negative or neutral affect, which is an interesting observation. Young children begin describing themselves using pronouns at around this time. Negative evaluations from parents cannot really be challenged by a 2-year-old, right? They cannot yet discount negative appraisals by parents as they're just having a bad day, right? So this is why really negative, critical feedback from caregivers can be so harmful, right, to a young 2-year-old, right? They're not yet able to mentalize their parents' behavior. And by mentalize their parents' behavior, I mean a 2-year-old is not yet able to think of the contextual factors that might contribute to their parents acting in a sort of critical or rude way, right? Like as an adult, if someone insults you, right, if you're a relatively mature individual, you might be able to kind of understand a person's insults as a function of them just having a bad day. Well, that comes through having a much more advanced sort of cognitive skill, right, an understanding of contextual factors. A 2-year-old doesn't yet have that sort of understanding of contextual factors, situational factors that might contribute to negative appraisals from others, right? So that feedback can be much more, damaging to a young child. We'll talk a little bit about self-regulation again and emotion regulation. So again, these are very important ideas. They were in Module 1. We're going to continue kind of looking at the role of self-regulation and emotion regulation in development. And the reason why these are so important is, again, because we need to be able to regulate ourselves for controlled, effortful behavior, right? Pulling your hand from the cookie jar because you can't have dessert before dinner. That's an example of self-regulation, right? So if a kid's like, oh, I really want that cookie, it's like, oh, but I know I'm not supposed to have dessert before dinner, right? That's an example of self-regulation. Excitement for the cookie and displeasure with the dish of veggies are moderated, right? The cookie will be even better after dinner, right? It'll taste even better as a treat afterward, right? Or, this plate of veggies isn't so bad, right? These are, again, examples of kind of regulating displeasure that we're having. That the capacity to do that is a sign of healthy emotional development. So, learning to regulate. Effective self and emotion regulation, again, emerge in the context of a caring, nurturing relationship. We learn how to regulate our emotions. We learn how to regulate ourselves by internalizing positive early experiences with a caring other. Language development, right, also helps the child learn to regulate as they're able to remember stated rules and expectations. But I would say that language development also helps us learn to regulate because then we have words for our feelings. We can label them and understand them as our vocabulary expands. And if I know that I'm angry, then that's the first step toward me not being angry, because I can actually name and identify how I'm feeling and then think about what I'm needing in order to soothe myself, right? So having words for our feelings, this is why naming our emotions is such an important aspect of regulation, of self-regulation. So guilt and shame, we talked about as self-conscious emotions, that those really begin to emerge and are related to kind of breakdowns in regulation. So again, shame and guilt are, particularly shame, right, is a major impediment to self-regulation, because we look at ourselves as being kind of fundamentally bad. And if I see myself as like fundamentally wrong or bad, there may be nothing that I can do then to feel better. If it's me and it's my fault, and the reasons why things are going bad is because I'm just a bad person, it's very hard to then regulate negative emotions, because where does that leave us, right? If we're just fundamentally flawed, then there's really nothing we can do to correct the situation, because it's a fundamental flaw. That's what it means to be fundamental flaw, right? It's like, it's not something I can just easily talk myself out of. And so that's why, again, this sort of real negative criticism, harsh judgment, harsh penalties, children can internalize that as I'm bad, right? And that thought that I'm bad makes it very hard then to regulate effectively. So as we grow, right, our needs change and shift, right? As a child develops and matures, there's a growing need to explore, and thus a growing need for some autonomy, right? Exploration sometimes implies exploring on my own, right? And autonomy referring to my sense that I can make things happen on my own, that I can make up my mind about what to do, right? And that as a child grows, that, they have a need for some autonomy, for some independence. And so the way parents respond to this need plays a real crucial role in the development of the child's self-concept. In other words, right, when parents encourage and support their children in exploring individually, that promotes a sense of competence and confidence, right? That I can do things, that I'm capable, that I'm competent, which would result in a more positive self-concept. So again, recall Erikson's model of how trust precedes autonomy. If a child trusts the caregivers, they can explore more. So it's when parents kind of thwart their children's curiosity and exploration that children can grow more in kind of guilt and shame. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the dimension of parenting styles, okay? And there's these two major dimensions that we're talking about when we talk about the dimension of parenting. So we have the warmth dimension, which refers to parental responsiveness, how responsive parents are to their children's needs. And then we have the control dimension, which is parental demandingness, right? The rules and limits that parents set for their kids. And there's this model of the soft-touched firm edge, which was developed by a psychologist named Michael Axelman in his care parenting model, right? Children need to meet limits and feel contained, right? It is important to have appropriate limits and boundaries for kids. They can't just do whatever they want. But children need some patience and understanding and encouragement from their parents. So there is a need to establish clear, firm limits, but there's also a need to communicate those limits in an age-appropriate, supportive, and encouraging voice. Because remember, like we said, children start to differentiate emotions in part based on auditory channels. So the tone of voice a parent uses, right, is actually really important. How they communicate the limits to their children is important. Whether they do that in a nice, soft, compassionate way or in a really harsh, critical, punitive way. So operating from a sort of child-centered approach, what would that mean, right? That would mean accounting for the child's developmental needs, tasks, and obstacles when communicating with the child. So instead of a more parent-centered approach, which is communicating based on what I need as a parent right now, I'm trying to communicate based on, well, what does this child need? Like what how can I communicate in a way that promotes their autonomy and creativity and play, right? And child-centered communication, right, presents a more supportive, positive emotional climate. We want kids to invest more trust in their environment as they age, right? To feel competent in completing tasks, right? That's really what paves the way for us feeling like we can take initiative, right? Set goals and achieve them, right? Developing kind of spontaneity that our goals feel like they're our own, right? Not those of our parents, right? That the things that are important to us are important because we feel that they are important, that we believe that these are important, not because someone else told me to. So what happens, right, when a parent fails to convey any warmth and instead appears threatening, dangerous, or hostile? What happens if a parent doesn't consider or otherwise ignores the impact of the child's developmental tasks and needs and obstacles when communicating with a child? Right? Well, that would foster then a more negative emotional climate, right? Where children start to see themselves as like fundamentally, again, bad, right? Promotes more shame, which raises the likelihood of having more mistrust in the environment, right? Developing excessive guilt or shame about the self, right? Thwarting exploration, living more kind of, a rigid, sort of inflexible, in a more rigid, inflexible way. So the parental demandingness part, right, which is the firm edge part of that care parenting model, right, is about establishing behavioral control and discipline, right? Establishing age-appropriate behaviors, right? Maturity demands. Limit setting can be done in either a child-focused or parent-focused way. And again, we're trying to communicate in a child-centered way as much as possible, right? Child-focused meaning a desire to build social skills, learning relational give and take. Parent-focused meaning kind of a more desire to have a convenient, seamless reality free of problems for the parent, right? So this is more about act this way because it makes my life easier, rather than do this because this will help you grow appropriately and learn how to negotiate consensual reality with other people. Right? And more child-focused in private, but more parent-focused in public, right? That's a question I'm posing here at the end, right? Which is sometimes, right, what we see is that parents might lean or tilt more toward parent-focused communication in public, maybe because they might feel embarrassed or humiliated if their child does something in public that could, look embarrassing to them or something, right? And so it is important to try and be consistent. Of course, we can understand why parents might get a sort of strong reaction to something their child says or does in public that might seem like inappropriate. But again, no matter the context or situation, it's important to try to communicate in a way that promotes, that does not promote, I should say, right, a sense of shame or guilt. And so here I want to highlight this really important point, right? That behavioral control is not the same as psychological control. Right? Behavioral control is about influencing a child's observable behaviors, establishing rules and expectations, promoting interest in others in the social world, right? Behavioral control is like, you don't do that in certain situations because that might make other people, that might hurt someone else, or that someone else might not want you to do that because that would be disrespectful to them or whatever, right? Behavioral control is about trying to teach social skills. Like, this is how, mature, age-appropriate, we're trying to teach mature, age-appropriate behaviors along the way, right? Psychological control, on the other hand, is about inducing mental states that make children easier to manipulate or control, right? And those are not the same thing, right? Psychological control is much more manipulative, right? Like guilt tripping or shaming kids into doing things because that would be bad, or that would be embarrassing, or that would be shameful. So again, the kind of communication parents choose to use goes a long way toward developing a healthy sense of self. So here we'll look at the 4 parenting styles, right? We have, again, the 2 dimensions of parental warmth and parental demandingness. And then we have accepting, responsive, child-centered, right, under the heading of parental warmth, versus lack of warmth, right, rejecting, unresponsive, parent-centered. And then on the demandingness dimension, right, we have Exercising behavioral control makes increasing maturity demands. And then we have does not exercise behavioral control, makes few demands. And we could see the 4 different styles then that emerge from these 2 dimensions. So the authoritative style would be high levels of warmth and high levels of demandingness. So a parent that sets very clear expectations and rules, that places appropriate demands, but does so in a way that's accepting, responsive, and child-centered. That's kind of what we're aiming for, right, is the authoritative style. The authoritarian style is placing high demands, right, making increasing maturity demands, but doing that in a way that's more parent-centered, unresponsive, or rejecting of the child. Whereas high levels of warmth, but few demands, is what we call a more permissive style. And then we have the last one, right, kind of neglecting, uninvolved, would be low level of warmth and low level of demandingness. Just kind of utter neglect. So the authoritative style is most correlated with positive outcomes, right? That's the one we're really aiming for. Soft touch, firm edge. That's what we're aiming for, right? High levels of warmth, but high levels of demandingness. Setting appropriate rules and expectations, but communicating those rules and expectations in a child-centered, responsive, appropriate way. The authoritarian style is most correlated with children who are more irritable, conflicted, and rated higher on anxiety and anger. Right? These children appear more likely to conform with authority out of fear, right? Possess fewer social skills. They don't learn, to follow rules because it's the right thing to do necessarily. They learn to follow rules out of fear of the consequences that might follow out of following those rules. So these children may exhibit more self-control in the presence of authorities, but lack self-regulation when they believe they're not being monitored. So, kids who grow up in an authoritarian household, for example, may follow all the rules and do all the right things when they know they're being watched. But then in private, right, that's like when they're like, oh, I'm not being watched. Now I can kind of do whatever I want. And you can see how that could create, certain problems or impulse control issues. The permissive style is more correlated with children who are more impulsive, display more uncontrolled behavior, right? We observe lower levels of self-reliance, right? That they've not yet, because relatively few demands have been made on them, that they come to rely then on others to get things done because they've never really developed a stronger sense of competence in the self. And then the neglecting, uninvolved style is correlated with children with high impulsivity, but also higher levels of what we call externalizing, internalizing problems, right? Aggression, withdrawal. We also observe relatively lower levels of self-esteem, and that's not hard to imagine why, right? Children who would have low self-esteem in a more neglecting environment. Okay, so how do parents set limits, right? Limit setting is a kind of central theme here in this module, right? But it's the methods of limit setting that matter, right? Limit setting might include like withdrawal of privileges, right? Or timeouts, or power assertion, right? A physical reprimand. Like, it's not necessarily abusive to, kind of grab, a child by the arm to keep them from, running into traffic, for example, right? Like, that would be considered a more physical reprimand, but it may be necessary under certain conditions, right? Harsh or severe power assertions, though, often correlate with more aggression and poor self-regulation when not being monitored by parents. Psychological control often involves strategies that blend, right? Like inducing shame and withdrawing love, aimed at obtaining immediate compliance, right? So making the child kind of feel bad about themselves and then withdrawing love, right? Withdrawing affection, right? That's a form of manipulation, right? Making the child feel that there's something wrong with them, and then at the same time becoming less affectionate, kind of giving them the silent treatment, for example. So the soft touch, right, explanations and rules are an important part of the warmth dimension. So again, we're setting limits, but we're doing so in a warm way, right? We're demonstrating consequences using other-oriented explanations. look, I know you love to run around here, but that could hurt your brother, so you need to stop now. Right? Would be an example of how to set a firm edge, but doing so in a way that communicates warmth still. Right? Induction refers to verbal explanations meant to instill clear rules and appropriate forms of behavior across varying contexts. Right? Induction is about getting kids to learn the rules, right? The rationale. Right? It's important for kids to understand the reason why it's important for me to do X, Y, or Z behavior. Right? Internalizing these rules leads to better self-regulation. And so our approach may vary across situations, but what matters, again, is the overall quality of the parent-child relationship. But again, how much does parenting style really matter when it comes to influencing children? What if it's the children themselves, right, who are eliciting an authoritative parenting style? Like, what if it's just easier babies, like we said from earlier, the temperament is what really drives it here, right? More mild-mannered, easier babies might make it easier to be authoritative. Or what if it's genetic? What if just really nice, confident, happy people make nice, confident, happy babies, right? Something kind of like that. What if it's all genetic? Perhaps more flexible, warm adults produce more flexible, warm babies. Again, right, we can't lose that systems perspective that takes into account both proximal and distal processes, right? So even if there are genetic contributions to all of this, goodness of fit, right, matching our style to the needs of the baby, to the needs of the child, all of that's still relevant and important. So here are some variables that moderate parent-child relationships. Right? The child's temperament shapes the parent-child relationship, right? It just does, right? The baby's temperament will have an effect on the parents, which will affect maybe how they provide care, right? The child's health needs can impact the parent-child relationship, right? A child that has a high number of health problems can, that can understandably generate a lot of stress. Parents' beliefs and values influence the parent-child relationship. Parents' mental health plays a role in the quality of the parent-child relationship. And then all these other things also can influence the parent-child relationship, right? So all these contextual factors can matter when it comes to the quality of that relationship. And so what about cultures, right, with both high levels of warmth and harsher levels of discipline? Right? If parents' methods are in line with cultural values and seem to meet the child's own expectations of how to relate to others, is there a problem? And I would say, again, it depends on the overall quality of that relationship. If the child doesn't see the kind of harsher discipline as being unusual or excessive, it may be fine, right? One can be firm and maybe even harsh without necessarily being cruel or malicious, right? So that's important to keep in mind. Corporal punishment, right? That's something, maybe a topic that I'll add some optional reading this week on things like spanking and corporal punishment. Are some forms of corporal punishment okay? If so, how should they be delivered? Those are going to be some maybe extra questions for us to consider. Then we're going to end here with the development of the early moral self. And so you'll recall from Freud's psychoanalytic theory that the superego is the psychic agency that represents one's parents' morality. So a harsh superego can lead to relentless self-criticism and perfectionism, right? Maybe more people-pleasing behaviors again, right? Positive, responsive parenting promotes self-regulation. Self-regulation supports conscience, right? This idea of acting in a way that's in alignment with my personal values and morals. So we have this idea of the minimum sufficiency principle, right? What is the minimal sufficient level of discipline that supports attention to the problem while avoiding fearfulness? Again, we want people to follow rules because out of a concern or care for themselves and others, not because they're afraid. Right? We don't want people necessarily following rules just because they're afraid of the consequences. We want them to follow rules because they understand why this is important for my own safety, my own self-respect, and the respect and safety of others. All right? Individual children have varying levels of arousal and reactivity. So again, this is where goodness of fit comes back in. So even difficult kids still need, responsive, timely, warm caregiving. And so we'll just have a note here on this idea of self-esteem versus self-compassion. Now, I want us to understand that self-esteem is an important thing, right? But self-esteem can be artificially inflated when one is unaware of one's own strengths and limitations, right? In other words, if I don't know what my limitations are as an individual, I might think that I'm capable of doing anything. But we all have limitations, right? I mean, I think it's important. I don't think in our culture we really emphasize enough, or we don't always help people recognize like what they reasonably can do, right? We can't just achieve literally anything we set our mind to, actually, okay? Like, I wasn't going to become an astronaut, okay, right? Like, this idea of like you could just be anything you want in the world isn't really true, okay? Like, yes, it's important to set big goals, high ambitions, but we also have to deal with our own personal limitations, right? So this can cause problems, right? If somebody has a really artificially inflated high self-esteem, and then what they do is they try to do a task that they're actually not capable of achieving independently, right? That can be an extremely frustrating, disorienting experience. So there's a different construct, which we call self-compassion, which looks at which aspects of self one values and the aspects of self which one is more ashamed of. And through self-compassion, right, we can more accurately recognize and accept our weaknesses and limitations, both of ourselves and others, without the judgment, right? Because we realize that there are just limits. So there's no point in judging, right? It's just, this is my limitation. I just can't do X, Y, or Z. It's outside of my competence. So why judge myself for it? That's just not for me, or that's not for you. So it's like when we can accept ourselves and our limitations and weaknesses, we're in a position to reserve judgment and then, reduce self-judgment, self-criticism, because we recognize these as just realistic limitations that can't always be overcome or surmounted. So we'll wrap up here with just a couple discussion questions which will be relevant for your final reflection at the end of the semester. Right? What kind of parenting style or styles did you experience growing up? So think authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, neglecting. What personality traits, characteristics, or other contextual factors make it harder for some kids to learn compliance or learn how to follow the rules? So this will just provide you a little bit of time to reflect in preparation for that final reflection. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture for Module 2. Make sure that you go through each of the videos and items there, respond to the discussion prompt, and take that second quiz all before next Saturday. And I'll see you next week.